when you think you fixed it, just give us a sign and we'll come back.
Yeah,
so my name is Kathryn Travers, so I'll be kind of chairing this webinar here today, and I'm really excited to welcome you all to the webinar called Looking Back, Looking Forward, the Safe Cities for Women Movement. I think it's important also to wish you all a very happy Earth Day. And also to note that this event is actually taking place within Anti-Street Harassment Week, and so it's very, I think, a good timing for us to take a look at some of these conversations. We know that today women's safety and gender inclusion are really huge topics, and I think one of the successes of the movement has been that they've been embedded in global normative frameworks, so including the Sustainable Development Goals, the New Urban Agenda, and so this is a really big achievement, but it doesn't mean that that's where the work is starting. In fact, the work began around the world decades ago, and so that's what we're here for today. In fact, is really we have the privilege to hear from some firsthand accounts of some of the early pioneering work from different regions of the world and from some of the mothers of the movement. So for the webinar here today, the format that we're going to be using is kind of a Q&A session with our 3 different panelists. So we have someone from Canada, from Argentina, and from India, who I'll introduce a little bit later. And as Kalpana had mentioned early on as well, in the Zoom, you'll see at the bottom, there is a place for Q&A. It says Q&A, which is different from the chat box where all of you are right now writing where you're from, your organizations, and your countries. So if you have any questions, as they arise, please write them into the Q&A box. And there's going to be 2 ways that we're treating them. One is someone might be able to respond to it quickly as we go. Otherwise, we're going to be taking note of them on the side, and we'll pull them together for a Q&A session that'll be more open and interactive at the latter part of our session today. And so before we really, I guess, get started into that, I've also been asked to kind of highlight some of the moments that have punctuated this, if you will. And so I think how I'm going to do that is going to be talking about 3 conferences that we had. And so at first, and this is kind of what we're here to explore too, you'll see that a lot of the work started from the women's movement and activists and feminists in different cities around the world. And then it kind of came together for the first time at a global level in 2002 in Montreal for the first international conference on women's safety. And so out of that, there was a bit of an acknowledgement that somewhat of an informal network of groups who are working on women's safety in urban public spaces had been formed. And there was an idea that it would be great to formalize that and to maintain that network into something that could be living, where knowledge could be shared, where tools and practices could be shared. And so an outcome of that conference was actually the creation of an organization called Women in Cities International, which is an organization that I've been involved with for a long time and I continue to be involved with. And so after that, there was the conference kind of migrated to different regions. And so from there, we went to Latin America. And so Carolyn is from Canada, and then we went to Latin America, where Falu is in Bogota for the 2nd International Conference on Women's Safety. And then we went over to India, where Kalpana is, for the 3rd International Conference on Women's Safety. And what was really interesting in all of that was not only that more and more people were getting involved in this kind of work, it was also really seeing that we could trace back to these different conferences as kind of pivotal moments where people shared tools, their conceptual approaches to work on women's safety in urban public spaces had expanded. They brought that information home to their own cities and continued to innovate in really exciting ways. And so there were really kind of pivotal moments. And at the culmination of that 3rd International Conference on Women's Safety, I think everyone looked around the room and realized that what had been created, in fact, was what we called a movement. And we were able to consider that now we had this movement around the issue of women's safety in urban public spaces. And so that was also kind of a big achievement. And then to have it really embedded formally within the Sustainable Development Goals and within the New Urban Agenda, I think is a huge achievement of that and really validates all of the work that has happened before. But because all of that work has happened before, and because now we see such a rising interest in this topic, and you can see even from all of you who've joined us today, and many familiar faces, but many new names, that people who perhaps hadn't been directly engaged with us in the past too. You know, we really see that the interest in the topic is expanding. Different groups working on the topic is expanding. Different issues being addressed are expanding. But it comes from this really strong, long foundation where knowledge and tools and experience have been created, have been developed, have been harnessed. And it's really important that we share that and that we build from that. And so I'm really excited about this session here today. It's a real privilege for me to be here with some of the mothers from the movement, whose work has really kind of paved the way for so many other feminists and people who kind of brought into this field too, like myself. And so I feel a great gratitude towards all of you. And Kalpana, I'm not sure if your mic is good and you want to add something.
Let me try.
Yeah.
How is it now?
Quiet.
It's
a bit quiet, but we can hear you.
Okay, so I'm going to try and speak a little louder. Is this better?
Yeah.
Sort of? Okay. I'm sorry, technology always fails us. So welcome to everyone, and I am Kalpana Viswanath, and I am from Safetipin, who is hosting this seminar, this webinar. It was wonderful to hear the introduction that Kathryn gave to the entire movement, and we're going to be discussing this as we go on. There are three things I just want to share. One is that this is it okay, Shmita? One is that this is part of a larger webinar series. This is the first one, looking back, looking forward. We will be having one or two more in the coming months. Secondly, the hashtag for this is looking back, looking forward. Please tweet, all of you, Instagram, Twitter, use this. And thirdly, I would like to use this opportunity to just share that a little bit about Safetipin. I know many of you know about Safetipin, but some of you don't. I am here, Safetipin is hosting this webinar. I am here representing both Safetipin and Jagori. Jagori is a women's organization, more than 35 years old in India. And I will be talking about the Jagori work when I speak about the movement. Safetipin is a much younger and newer organization. We are a technology platform that has built on the work of the Safe Cities movement and tried to build a feminist tool in the hands of women and young people and others to sort of negotiate, to advocate with city governments using data, using robust data, because we know in today's age, data, as they say, is the new gold. They used to say it was the new oil, but we don't know with the oil prices dipping like this. So with the gold also dipping, so we don't know what it is, but data in itself is hugely valuable. It's a good tool for advocacy. So Safetipin has several apps. There's an app called My Safetipin. Those of you who are new to this, please do download it. It's a free app available on the App Store and Google Play. And it is used to do safety audits and give data about safety in cities. I'm not going to speak more about Safetipin, just to say that we are delighted to have this panel here. I mean, all these three women are like my dear, dear friends. And I think we've all sort of grown up in this movement together. Carolyn and Anna, I mean, I know Kathryn put me with the mothers, but Carolyn and Anna are a little bit of a mother to me also. And I sort of come in between. And I have been so inspired by their work. So I'm going to hand it back to Kathryn to continue this.
Perfect. So I think without further ado, we are going to get started. So we're going to start with Carolyn. So happy to introduce Carolyn. So Dr. Carolyn Weitzman is currently an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa, who's working on developing national housing networks. Previously, she coordinated the Toronto Safe City Committee from 1989 to 1999, and was also a professor of urban planning at the University of Melbourne in Australia from 2003 and to 2019. So welcome, Carolyn. Great to have you here today.
It's great to see you, Kathryn.
So my first question for you is, I was wondering, so you were really involved in some of that pioneering Safe Cities work that came out of Toronto in the late 80s and 90s. Can you please share a bit about this work? And in particular, we're interested to hear about how it was to work with local government on these issues.
Thanks, Kathryn. I should mention before I go any further that I'm here in Ottawa on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. In Toronto, who knows how a movement starts? We were inspired a bit by work done in London. There was a great report called Changing Places on Women in Planning that came out of the Greater London Council in 1986. In the mid-1980s, there was growing concern around violence against women. And there was a wonderful conjunction of politicians who could be enablers, including Councillor Barbara Hall, who later became mayor. And there were femocrats, feminist bureaucrats within the city government who wanted to see the limits of what the city of Toronto could do. And then, of course, there were very powerful women's group advocates. And there were also researchers such as Gerda Weckerle from York University who were interested in coming up with useful data, but also in documenting what was going on. So Kalpana and Carolyn, Andrew, and myself wrote an article a few years ago called 4 Legs of a Table, and it really took those 4 legs to get things going. We started off with what I'd consider some easy wins, at least it was in Toronto. We were reviewing our master plan and we decided that we were going to look at safety in relation to particularly train stations and other public transport, and also to some new major developments and parking garages, which were an area of concern. But we quickly turned to social development as well. We got free women's self-defense in 30 community centers across the city. And very soon afterwards, we created a grants program called Breaking the Cycle of Violence, which allowed community organizations like Working Women's Community Center to develop material in about a dozen languages that could be distributed in grocery stores, hairdressers, etc. So really the emphasis was on getting the word out about resources that could be used, implementing the women's safety audit, which had been developed in 1988 by METRAC in Toronto, a women's organization working with the metropolitan level of government, and in making sure that everyone from the police to public transport to public health and to our city-owned public housing were implementing the safety, the empowering women's safety work that we were talking about.
Fabulous. And I think we all know too, everyone really has a role to play in all of this. What would you say are some of the key challenges or lessons that you learned from some of this early work?
Well, I'm sure that the challenge continues today. There was always pushback, particularly from some politicians, but also some members of the public. Why are you focusing on women's safety? And I said at that point that we were focusing on women's safety, but we were also focusing on gendered violence and realizing that there's a lot of male-on-male violence as well, but that gender was such an important part of the equation in terms of how violence was experienced, but also what kind of response there was to violence. So we were just trying to put gender into the equation when we were talking about violence in both public and in private space. That was one area of pushback. We certainly got an area of pushback when we started talking about the importance of community grants. And that's really where the power of being embedded within local government happened, because there were 17 councillors there, and some, like I've already mentioned, Barbara Hall, Jack Layden, were very much in favor of the work we were doing. Others were very resistant. And each of the organizations that we were working with, the feminist organizations, chose a politician and spoke to them, got an appointment and spoke to them on a one-to-one basis. And that really turned things around in terms of that incredibly important Breaking the Cycle of Violence grants program. So I think a lot of the groups that I'd been working with and myself had been very much on a kind of to the barricades form of feminist advocacy, which is also very important. but we also discovered that there's a lot of power in one-on-one discussions with people and sort of appealing to their better sentiments and their own experiences of violence. That was really a wonderful enabler. So to some extent, the challenge of pushback against a feminist approach became an enabler when we talked to people as other people and made change in that way.
It's so great to hear you talk about transforming that challenge of pushback to become an enabler, if you will, too, because I think, you know, one of the things we talk about a lot lately is that there is such a big pushback to all of this work. And I think that we can see that quite clearly. I guess I wondered, do you have any kind of suggestions for how to do that transformation for other groups who are maybe starting this work? A challenge we often hear, in fact, is from women's groups, is that engagement with local authorities and local governments and how to get them on board. So did you have any kind of tips for new groups who are getting into this work?
Well, certainly if you're doing a physical move about an area and you're able to include one or two, not a dominant group, but one or two people who are actually decision makers. I remember going around a particular train station with the head of the transit authority who started off a little bit condescending about what he knew, and he didn't believe it was much of a problem. And by the end of that walkabout, which I call a moveabout because there were people with mobility disabilities, he was like, holy cow, we've got to do something right now. So the question of to what extent you involve powerful decision makers, it's always a little bit of a balance. You don't want them there shutting down on the experts of experience, but you also don't want to just present a report and say, you need to do this without involving people in the process. So you need to involve the decision makers at a fairly early stage, tell them you're going to do it, tell them feel free to come along, but we're listening to the voices of the people who actually live here. That was a really useful tip. And the other incredibly fantastic thing, which you've already mentioned, is build your network of peers. So at a very early stage, the Toronto City Committee was working with a group called Femmes et Ville. It's equivalent in Montreal, the second largest city in Canada. And pretty soon we brought in Ottawa and Kitchener and Calgary and other Canadian cities. So we would get together in the 1980s, in the early days of the internet, and we'd go, oh my God, you wouldn't believe what just happened. What do I do about this? And we had a very strong bilingual group of compadres, I mean, bring in a third language, allies, peers who were doing the same thing. And then we realized that needed to go internationally because we were getting more and more inquiries from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia. And that's how the first international conference on women's safety happened in Montreal in 2002. So, the peer support network was incredibly important.
And I'm going to pivot on that, actually. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you about was that 2002 conference. So could you share with us a bit about, I guess, some of the ideas behind the origins of the conference, maybe some of the, that sun really just came out on me, maybe some of the kind of, what were your key takeaways from it, or things that you might want to share? How was it to be there for that first moment? Did you have a sense that you were kind of creating history?
I think when I look back on 2002, which is almost 20 years ago now, it felt like a culmination as much as a start, because many of us had already been working for a dozen years when we got together. But I personally had my eyes open. You can read as much as you want about issues of the Global South, but there was one workshop that I was chairing in English and French and Spanish, and there was a local politician who, it was on women in political leadership, who talked about some really important work on making bike paths safer in Montreal. And then the next speaker was from Latin America. I actually now realized that she was from El Salvador. And she talked about having been kidnapped by a paramilitary group when she decided to run for local government, and she and her family were threatened with death if she continued going for elected office. And I thought, wow, we really need to have the Global South leading these discussions from now on, because it's much easier to learn from relatively privileged backgrounds what to do from places that have less money and really horrific power structures. But you know, we really need people who are dealing with water and sanitation and police violence to be going in the forefront and coming out of situations of lack of democracy, because these are the folks that we really need to learn from.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Carolyn. I think that's actually kind of a great pivot now to go to hear a bit more about some of this work in Latin America. And I mean, I completely agree as well. You know, I think that the context of different cities, different regions, even within cities, and the different lived experiences of different women according to their multiple identities as well, certainly means that their safety experiences in urban public spaces are different and are shaped by all of those factors. And so it's critical that we shed light on it and that we recognize, you know, obviously their expertise to speak to those issues. All right, Anna, I'm going to turn to you.
Okay.
So Ana Falu is an Argentinian feminist and social activist. She's also an architect and urbanist, a researcher, professor, practitioner, and a well-recognized feminist in Latin America, but in the Caribbean and also worldwide. So she serves as gender expert for the Union of Cities and Local Governments and Union of Iberoamericana de Municipalistas, and is co-founder of several networks, including the Women in Habitat Network of Latin America, the Wairo Commission, and Articulación Feminista Mercosur. So thank you so much for being here, Anna.
Hello, Kathryn. This is
Hi.
a pleasure. Thank you very much for this invitation. I feel very privileged, and thank you to Kalpana. And so good to be here with Carolyn, with you. So thank you very much, and with all the people. It's amazing, all the people interested in this webinar.
Absolutely. And so, Anna, as one of the things Carolyn was just alluding to was that the issues kind of emerge in different ways in different contexts, and certainly did in Latin America. So one of the organizations that you were involved with, so the Women in Habitat Network, or Mujer y Habitat, was developed as part of that work. I was hoping you could share with us a bit about this process and how you picked the first cities to join and build this network in Latin America.
Well, just to answer your question, I think we need to make a bit of history, you know, and a bit of reflection, both. Because the history, I mean, it starts, I prepared some slides, but I don't know if we can share that, because I think it's important to talk about the history, and we started in Latin America in the framework of the returning of the democracy, in the building of a strong feminist movement after all the dictatorship period. And in that context, we start, very few of us, we were 4 or 5 in Latin America. That's why maybe we very rapidly get in touch one to the other, and also to the international partners, yeah, particularly the Canadians, from whom we learn a lot, and they inspire our work. And then we started to think and to work on housing and women, services and women, time use and women, and several projects that started in the late 80s and went on till the late 90s. In the late 90s, we started with an urban indicator study, which in which study the violence emerged as a central issue. And in that moment, we started really to work very rapidly to put the focus on the violence that women experience in the cities. And we met Anne Michaud from Toronto, And we met and been so much inspired about the experience and the safe audits and the methods that were being experienced and proved in Toronto and in Montreal. And then we start to work. But this was also a part, and was all this work was on a hand with all this feminist movement, very strong in construction, with all the feminist meetings in the Latin American and Caribbean feminist meetings that started in '81 in Bogota, yeah, and we've been building a political agenda for women's rights. In that agenda for women's rights, we succeeded in introducing, not early, it took time, you know, the right to women to a life without violence in the public space, in the cities, because violence was strongly being worked and denounced indoors, but not seeing this continuing concept of violence inside and outside. And well, Latin America did a lot of contribution in that sense. We did the work, and we worked interdisciplinary with other disciplines, with anthropologists, with sociologists, with geographers, and learning a lot one from the other. We, the architects and the urbanists that were in the Women and Habitat Network of Latin America since '85, just imagine, working and trying to build these new concepts. So I think we need to address also to the other side of this contest of Latin America, that is inequality. And we were working in the context of inequality, of poverty, where the demands of women for everyday life, quality of life, was also a violence. The violence of the lack of services, the lack of housing, the lack of water, the lack of security, lack of citizenship, I like to say, yeah? So these fragmented cities, these urban phenomena in which a minority at the 90s start to live in this controlled housing schemes with own security, yeah, with the best conditions compared to the majorities of the population living in other conditions and the majorities in informality, with all this lack of rights, yeah? And the majority of women were living in those conditions. And these women were the most vulnerable to this condition, to this violence. And also, you had in parallel an increase in violence in the cities of Latin America. So these are concurrent phenomena that we needed to take all together, you know, the inequality, the poverty, the growing of the agenda of the feminists and the political agenda, including cities and the rights of women to the cities and a life free of violence, and also this increasing of violence in the cities and the lack of including into the security programs cities violence. So this was the context in which we started our cities free of violence, cities, safe cities for all program in Latin America. That was a flagship program. It was a program that started in 5 cities and very fast grew to 7 cities in 7 countries. And then it grew along, because in Mexico, the government took the program. In Brazil, the government took the program and worked in, I don't know, if 10 or 12 cities of Brazil. So it grew along, yeah? It flourished along because it was fulfilling a demand that was very visible, and it was a demand that governments took into their agendas because of this violence and criminality that was growing, and also in parallel, the democratic increase of the Latin American society. of course, weak, fragile, but that was. So what we learn is that violence is related to social integration. That violence is not only the violence that women experience in our Latin American society, is a clear result of patriarchy, is a clear result of a conception of ownership, as Segato says, because the concept of inequality or different are not enough to explain what is happening with the women's body, the girl's body, and not only the diversity of sexual options, bodies that are being attacked, even killed. So we built together with the Americans, the North American scholars, the concept of feminicide, because women are being killed. During this close down of the pandemic, of the COVID-19, here in Argentina, my country, we have in 1 month, we have 23 women that were killed by their partner. So this is the situation of the violence on the bodies of women. Bodies that turn into political bodies, because are bodies that denounce, bodies that are saying this violence needs to be stopped. And then we, the architects and the urbanists, what we said? We said, well, the territories and the planning are also something to say of this violence. How are these unequal territories, these fragmented cities, contributing or not to this violence? How are the city fragments and the city public spaces built and lived that will contribute to this violence? And in that sense, we did a lot of contribution. And we worked it, and I think Carolyn said something that is key, and we learned from the experience of Montreal and Toronto, that we needed the decision makers, we needed the politicians, the technicians in the local government, but also we needed to have strong community organization as partners. If we didn't, those were the criteria. Local authorities that had a sensitivity on women's rights, women's mechanism in the local level, community groups, strong community groups, and feminist organizations in the cities where we start to install this concept of safe cities or cities without violence for women. And of course, our international partners, and you, the friends with whom we've been building this concept all around the world.
Thank you, Anna. You touched on so many really interesting points and shared a lot about the context at which it started, and also how you teased out the links between some really important dimensions of the everyday life, the public, the private, the political, planning, all of these kinds of key issues, of course, that shape how we live the city and experience the city. I guess what I want to know from you, and this is something that comes up quite a bit, is you mentioned a few times that there were lots of architects and urbanists involved in this pioneering work in Latin America. And right. Sometimes even now, in some of the work that I've done, some of the architects and urbanists don't necessarily see themselves as connected with this women's safety issues. And so in what ways do you think it's critical to have the architects and the urbanists around the tables? And how does that change the way we approach the issue?
Yeah. I think that the violence that is occurring in the cities, in the public spaces, is an expression also of a misogyny of the space, And well, to link these two concepts was not easy, It was not easy even I am at the university. I am an activist. I am the director of an NGO, but I'm also at the university and a researcher. And it was very difficult, you know, to really make clear and make clear to scholars and to students this importance of breaking the neutrality of the planning and the design approach. Yeah? And we succeeded. We succeeded, not absolutely, not totally, not all that we want, but now we have groups of our, students, feminist architects, professors talking about the different needs of women and men. And we succeeded at least in put some lens that can make people think that the design and the decisions on the urban space, the planning, the territorial definitions need to break the concept of neutrality, break the concept that planning is for a certain type of family, a certain type of person. And I think we are questioning the utopia of the modernity. Yeah? What I mean with that? I mean that we are questioning, for instance, the way that cities as Brasilia were planned, where the subject of the planning was the white man in a car. Yeah. So we succeeded in questioning that, and of course, many other voices from other fields and aspects and topics of the discipline came also to enrich this debate. This is one, but there is also something I would like to share with you, and is that in these past 2 decades, I think that the Safe Cities women and the feminists, we learn that we are working also at different scales of territories. One territory is our body, and our body is this first territory in which we need to make our decisions on our body, the reproduction, the sexuality, the way we live. Why? Because our body. Because we were penalized and violented, guilting women when they suffer a violence in the public space. As if the way you dress or the hour you are outside were something you should avoid and were not part of the freedoms on your decision and your way of living and decided on your body. But then we learn also that the house is a second scale, the house where still today the major violence is occurring. Yeah. So that house, how women appropriate of the house, the cuarto propio, I don't know how it's not coming in English. Yeah, the self room of Virginia Woolf. Yeah. How do we use the space in the house? How that space is designed and appropriated by the different members of the different type of families. That is another recognition. And then the neighborhood, then the city. And it came again, new concepts. And I think that Jane Jacobs, in the late 60s, taught us, and I think she was the first feminist in the debate of urbanism, yeah, and not by coincidence she left New York and went to Canada, I think, and Jane Jacob taught us of the importance of the proximity, and proximity as an attribute that also has to do with the quality of life, the space, and the possibilities of violence in the territories. So you can see, because I'm trying to make a synthesis, that this is a complex response, yeah? And it's a response that has layers and different entrances of analytical entrances. But these were part of what we in Latin America have been building. But when I say we, it's not only architects and urbanists, it's the architects and the urbanists together with other feminists thinking from a feminist perspective in how we appropriate the city, appropriate of our rights, and And we women learn this appropriation and this by transgressions. We built our citizenship by transgression because fear is always there. And we, in the only way we built our citizenship was overcoming that fears, yeah? And that happens in the everyday life of women in the poor neighborhoods, in the middle class. We, the professionals, yeah, we also overcome fears at the work and in the family, at the neighborhood, in the cities. And this is the way we've been building our strengths and our citizenship, yeah? So I think that we have to link the structural violences of the society with the violence we women live in the territories. I don't know if this is a kind of an answer to your question.
I think that's absolutely correct and absolutely perfect. You know, I think that when we talk about things, of course, especially lately, we talk a lot about intersectionality and considering the layers of different identities, you know, of how we move through this city, how that gets affected by us. And I think that perhaps we forget about all of these different spatial and political layers as well that kind
Of course. We don't have the time to go to all these entrances.
That's right.
And take more from the architects and urbanists. Yeah.
Right. So thank you very much for shedding light on that. So we're going to turn now to Kalpana, who of course is hosting us all here today. So Kalpana, well, thank you for hosting us and for being as part of the panel. Can we hear you? Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah. Perfect. Making sure we don't have a mic issue again.
Great.
So Kalpana Viswanath is co-founder of Safetipin, which is a mobile app developed to help collect useful data for community and women's safety. So she spoke about it a little bit at the beginning of the session. She's also the chair of Jagori, which is a well-known women's organization in India. And she started working on developing some safe cities programs for Delhi and for other cities, both in India and also globally. So Kalpana, moving now to the Indian context, which of course we know is very different from Canada and Latin America. Can you tell us a bit about what it was like to begin working on safe cities for women and girls in such a context? In particular, I think what we'd like to hear is if you could highlight some of the adaptations that you had to introduce to make the work respond to the pressing needs that we were facing in India.
Yeah, thank you. I think I want to take, the two ideas that have come up both in Carolyn and Anna's work is one is the issue of citizenship, the issue of the right to the city. So when we talk about safety, it is not just freedom from violence. It is the freedom and the right to be an equal citizen in a city. And the second one is it is all located in the woman's body. And I think that is something we can never forget when we do this work. In 2003, we began looking at this idea of public spaces in Delhi. Jagori is a very well-known feminist organization and part of the women's movement. And in India, there's been a lot of work, had been a lot of work at that time, both on domestic violence as well as sexual harassment at the workplace. But as through our work, we found that one area that had not been addressed enough was actually the street, the public space. When you stepped out, either to go to university or to your workplace, what happened then? And this came up to us in two ways. One was with young women that we worked with in universities and in the low-income neighborhoods. The second was, in 2003, in Delhi city, there was a very large sort of evacuation of slums from the center of the city to the periphery. So literally, the poor were thrown from the center of the city to the peripheries, where there was no services, there were no jobs, and there was no safety. There was no public space. There was very poor private space. So in that context, so in India and in Delhi, when we began and as we grew into other cities, the issue is always linked to the one of poverty, to one of lack of services, and to that of some the inequality that is inherent in all our cities that Anna talked about also. we have very, very unequal cities. And in the past 20 years, all our cities have become more unequal, not less unequal. And I think, so the one area that really we sort of focused on was looking at low-income neighborhoods. And the second area that I think became very big was, see, sexual harassment in public spaces in India, but in Delhi at that, when we were working at that time, was very normalized. It was just accepted. So everyone expected that, okay, if you got on a bus, you would be sexually harassed. And we have a terrible word that is used in India called eve teasing, which sort of completely trivializes the issue of sexual harassment. So it was like, oh, if you went out, of course, someone would paint your butt or, you know, pass a comment, fall on you when the bus took a break or when you were walking on the streets. So it was so normalized to somehow, to break that normalization, we came up with a campaign called Staring Hurts. You know, but everyone is willing to say that rape is very bad, but not someone passing a comment or someone saying, staring at you. But we wanted to look at the most, which seems like, oh, someone's just staring at you. But as a woman, you know that staring can be extremely violating of your sense of access and freedom to a space. So the campaign called Staring Hurts, it's an ad which is still available. You can look at the Jagori website. It was a very powerful ad which looked at how staring itself is unacceptable. And if we begin with that, every other form of sexual violence that takes place on our streets, in our public transport, is unsafe. And the third thing we learned here was really the issue of, which we talk about now, of intersectionality. But when we began working, we realized that me, Kalpana, because I would move around in a car and I lived in a certain neighborhood and I could speak English, I had a very different experience of the city than somebody else who was, say, maybe younger, who took public transport, who was from a rural background, or who lived in a neighborhood where she didn't have services. So right up front, intersectionality hit us in our head. And therefore, the safety audit tool was adapted. And it was really exciting for us at that time that both Carolyn Weitzman and Caroline Andrew, who was one of the founders of Women in Cities International, happened to visit India in that year. And so we were able to actually have the conversation at this time. And my colleague, Surabhi, who's part of this chat, this participant, we were the two who began working on this, and many, many other people, young people in Jagori, who at that time took it on. So it was super exciting to have this tool, which was actually an empowerment tool. It was not only a diagnostic tool, and that is the power of the safety audit. It diagnoses, but it empowers you as you diagnose.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. And so I think the next thing we want to hear about is, so as you mentioned, you know, the work started in Delhi, which is obviously a huge city, and you kind of touched on some of the complexity of dealing with that. Since then, you've also started working in many other cities in India. Can you tell us a bit, one of the challenges I think people often face is this idea of scale. So how do you reach out to and support work in different cities and support the expansion of the Safe Cities work to other cities? So can you speak to us a bit about that, please?
Yeah. So, you know, when we began, of course, you know, Delhi, many of you who live in India and outside know that Delhi has this a sort of a reputation of being an unsafe city. So it sort of seemed natural to begin the work in Delhi. But interestingly, when the second place that we went to was actually Kerala. Now, Kerala in India is the state which has the highest indicators on women's empowerment, including things like education, literacy, and work participation. But when we went there, we found that violence against women was so high, even in those cities. So the issue is that it's not as if education or development on certain, you know, parameters or indicators automatically reduce violence against women. Then, you know, and then we moved to, so we use a couple of tools. So one was a street survey, which was a very interesting survey in the sense that it was not, they didn't go into households and do it in detail, but in 10 minutes, you asked people on the street what they felt. And we came up across cities. My colleague from Akshara, Nandita, is also here in this webinar. In Mumbai, they did a similar study. Now, Mumbai is known to be a much safer city than Delhi, but even there, they found that almost 90% of the women had experienced some form of sexual harassment while accessing public spaces. Then we did some work in the Northeast and many other cities in India using similar tools, the safety audit tool, which measured both public space, public transport, and public services. I think that's where the expansion took place. And this survey, which began to talk about how 80% in this city, 90% of that city, and suddenly there was this sense that this is something women are living with. This is a silent kind of epidemic of violence. And we're talking about today what Anna said, along with the pandemic of COVID, we are seeing a pandemic of domestic violence.
Absolutely.
So this kind of epidemic of lack of safety that women and girls were feeling in public spaces. And what we really realized from this, which was extremely significant, that the lack of safety has several ramifications on women's lives. It is not only an act of violence. It affects your confidence. It affects your ability to access education, access work, access leisure, just be out in public spaces, do things, because it as Anna and Carolyn said, it is linked to social and cultural norms. It's not as if any of this exists outside normative frameworks in our society. And therefore, we took this and we recognized that across India, there were many differences, but there were many similarities. And therefore, now we actually have a national network of women's groups working on safe cities that has been convened by Jagori. And I think this is a very exciting thing. We actually were inspired by the Women in Habitat Network in Latin America, saying that if they could do a network across countries, and India is like many countries, it's a very big country, we should build a network like they do. So when Anna speaks, she speaks for the whole network. So therefore, when any of us go, we actually speak for the entire network and talk about it. So I think that has been the thing. And I think finally, let's answer your question about the scaling up. And I think that's been the biggest challenge for any of us. We know, as both my speakers earlier then said, that unless this is rooted in local government, it is a very small intervention. And we need to move beyond small interventions. We need to move beyond pilots. We need this to become institutionalized and a systemic change. Governments must own this process. And I think that's where we have had successes in countries across the world, and I think we know that UN Women, UN Habitat have been working on it. We will be having further conversations around this where we should invite people in those programs who are talking about it. And in 2010, when we had the third Women in Safety Conference in Delhi, we had participation from nearly 50 cities around the world. This was a fascinating thing. We had 250 people. We had the Delhi Declaration, which we presented to the Chief Minister at that time. So at that point, we felt like we were a global movement, and it had transformed itself so much from 1988 in Canada. Yet some core had been retained, which was placing at the center women's experiences, women's rights, and the need to address governments. That this is not something, it's not a women's issue. As we said in Jagori, women's safety is not a women's issue. Women's safety is an urban issue, and therefore it needs to be dealt with at the urban level by all stakeholders.
I mean, absolutely, and it's an issue. Everyone has a role to play in, as they say as well. I'm gonna change my last question for you to build off of what you just said as well. I mean, so you said, when you started doing studies and you found that upwards of 90% of people experience different forms of violence, including sexual harassment, things in the street that we neglect to have conversations around, and perhaps all lived with and intuitively know as women when we leave the house, the safety decisions that we make and the consequences that has on the way we move through and experience the city. And so sometimes, we need to make the case for things we already know, right? And that includes, as you said, doing different kinds of studies and collecting data and getting those data sets that we need to support what our daily experiences already are. And so you talked about the need of institutionalization, and I think everyone would agree that that's a case. Now, you also said that there was some good successes in terms of institutionalization. I wondered within an Indian context, if you can share maybe 1 or 2 key successes, and also how the work from the women's movement helped to influence that institutionalization process and those successes.
Thank you. I am going to share mostly about Delhi, because that's where I've been most centrally involved. When we began the work, it was done completely privately, and it was done by Jagori. We didn't have government buy-in at the time. What we did is we just did safety audits across the city and produced really pretty maps and took it all over the place to government officials. And they actually, it spoke to them, you know, because we found that mapping, and I think that's the most significant thing about this work, is that it's, when you visually show something, it sort of somehow makes sense to people rather than just numbers or words. The moment you put it on a map, they see it, it speaks to them. So we were able to get, and the first intervention we had was actually in public transport, because our data showed that more than 80% of the sexual harassment that took place was inside public buses. So we actually got a partnership to do sort of gender sensitization training of drivers and conductors. And at that time, we trained almost 4,000 drivers and conductors. Now, how has that got institutionalized? Today in Delhi, more than 100,000 drivers and conductors have got trained, because it has now become part of like it's a mandatory thing. Every year when they come in to renew their registration, they have to go through a 1-hour training on gender sensitization, on what is sexual harassment. So to me, that is institutionalization. Similarly, in Mumbai, Akshara did the similar thing. They worked with buses, and then they put it into their manual, into the manual for the buses. This has been done in many cities around India. So I think mobility, which is central to safety, got addressed there. In many cities in India and other cities, we have actually managed to get sort of women's safety committees within our local governments, which is led by the government, but which invites NGOs and other civil society partners to speak, to be part of it and to contribute. So what happens is, it's similar to what you had in Toronto, Kathryn, Caroline, but it just came much later in a very different form. It didn't come from the government, it came from the movement, from women's groups, from women's experiences, which pushed it to say, okay, now you take it up. And then the data produced across cities, we were able to push it, you know. So similarly in Kerala, there are very strong schemes and programs around this. There are, of course, things like pink autos and women-only buses, which is something that's come up in the question and answer. And I think we should answer that. Is that the question? You know, just getting women-only spaces. I mean, I don't think I'll answer that right now. We can go into it because it came in the question. But that's been the other thing, you know. It's like the Delhi Metro has a women's compartment. There are women-only kind of spaces. So that was one institutional response. I'm not saying whether that was right or wrong, but that was one. But certainly setting up these women's safety committees and coming up with programs. Like Delhi government, for example, has a full report which the government every 3 months meets with all the key stakeholders and asks them, what have you done on these commitments that you gave, whether it's the police, whether it's the transport department. So to me, that is an institutionalization of the process. And I think that's the direction we have to all go. Of course, all our innovations, all our innovative tools, our protests, our exciting art and things goes alongside with that to make it exciting. But unless we institutionalize it, it will always be a small change. We as women now want, you know, even in this COVID pandemic, we've realized that even today in 2020, there are so many fronts that we have to fight at all levels that I think we cannot settle for anything small anymore. We want the full revolution now. Yes. Kathryn, you're muted. Sure, Kathryn's muted. Can you unmute Kathryn? No? Yeah, okay.
Okay, I'm back. Yeah, sorry, my thing dropped for a second, but I'm back and unmuted. So thank you. I mean, I agree with you. We need the revolution. And I think that's a great way to end our panel exchange. We are going to move now to our questions. And so for anyone who hasn't already typed your question into the Q&A box here, so not in the chat box, in the Q&A at the bottom, please go ahead and do that. I took a look through some of the questions before. I think one of the recurring themes that seems to be coming out of here is what is the impact of a situation like COVID-19 on the issues of women's safety? Of course, we already mentioned domestic violence. What does it mean about what does it mean about, I guess, public spaces right now, and inclusion and just safety challenges in general within this context of COVID-19?
Well, I really like I don't like the notion, but I like the phrase that there's another parallel invisibilized pandemic, which is that the more that women and children are trapped in their homes with violent men, the less options there are to report abuse out of schools, workplaces, get assistance, etc. We also know that shelters right now, emergency shelters, are extremely unsafe places. One of the things that's coming out in Canada, and I am now working primarily in housing from a feminist perspective, is that you can't shelter safely in place without a safe place for you and your family that doesn't have shared bathrooms, shared kitchens, etc. So we know that there's going to need to be economic stimulus package, certainly in the countries that have the resources to do so coming out of COVID-19. We know that inequalities have been magnified and in some cases hopefully made more visualized. But just to give an example, so many people are finding it difficult to pay their rent when rent is already very unaffordable, that we need to really talk about safe and secure housing as a basic social determinant of health and how we're going to move forward out of COVID-19. The thing that really worries me is a reprivatization discourse. There's a lot of bad forms of density, for instance, 50 people in a homeless shelter without any protective devices. But there's also, I would hate to see a movement for everybody who can taking shelter in their private backyards or their private courtyards, the people who have wealth, in other words, because I've missed democratic public space in this moment a great deal, and I'm very worried about the future of dense mixed-use public spaces coming out of COVID, the future of public transport, as a lot of countries are going to hit an economic depression as well as social injustice. So every single thing that all countries are doing now, all cities are doing now, have to have inequality and the right to the city in the forefront. I mean, Kalpana said it so well, that the basis of our work is addressing inequalities through a right to the city framework. And that's sort of the starting point.
Kathryn is, I think, lost again. I think a couple of other questions that have come up. One is specifically on public transport and looking at there's a proposal in Britain to have safe new women-only lanes. There are things like pink taxis and stuff like that, which is another question which has come up. Anna, maybe you'd like to answer this question about how do you ensure the continuity of local governments and both elected as well as the bureaucracy to get change done, happen?
Yeah, I would like to comment on that, but I would like to say before entering into this, because of this frame of the global pandemic and this uncertainty we are living, that the cases of violence against women are breaking records, and that we have to be very aware of that, particularly in the silent cities of the lockdown. In these silent cities of the lockdown, we need to build a solidary alert to for zero tolerance to violence, not only against women, but also children and elderly. This is a point I would like to make here for the audience. And the second point I would like to make is related also to this compulsory isolation, which is, of course, it seems to be the tool against the COVID-19, but that to lock down into a house, you need to have a house. And in Latin America, there are many people that doesn't have a house. And to wash your hands, you need a tap. And if you don't have a tap, you cannot wash your hands. Then again, it comes the scales in which we should work. And one scale is the house, where people can lock down when they have a house. But another scale maybe is the community, and we need to think all together how to work very strategically, very fast to give solutions to these other scales where people is having so many constriction, yeah? And we are not going to talk about care and all that. But regarding to the question you made, Kalpana, I think that it is central. And when we did our Safe Cities Without Violence for Women, Safe Cities for All, that is a program, a regional program that upscale in different other, and that it continues. We did 4 or 5 central strategic lines. One was building knowledge. We thought that building knowledge was central, because we needed to discuss all these concepts and build concepts, yeah? And many anthropologists and sociologists supported us with those, contributed to that, the expulsions concept of CISCSA, the ownership concept, etc., etc. But also we developed a strong line that was working with the women's mechanism of the local authorities. And we thought that we needed to have an interlocution, I don't know how you say, an institutional body committed to women's rights. Otherwise, it was very difficult to work with the other sectors of the local government, like for instance, security. Yeah? All the local authorities have a group that is working on security in the city, but they never think in terms of women's security or the violence that women suffer as part of the security. So we did a lot of training, and the training was addressed mainly to the decision makers, the politicians, the techniques, and we still do that because we think that the training should be constant and continuous. It's not one training, one workshop, one webinar. No, no, no. We need to have that continuously, because we need to really be working on that conception to change the symbolic, we say, to change the ideology through which these technicians and politicians are seeing the concept of women and the role of women is very difficult. So we need to break down that neutrality, to break down those concepts, to bring new concepts and to alert them of this need. We also develop tools, and we use your tool, the Safetipin in Latin America. Yeah? We use it in Bogota, and similar tools were developed in other countries. So the use of these tools is evident and is contributing to democratize and to make people understand that where is happening the violence and at what time, which day, which are the burning moments and the burning places, yeah? And also to alert, to have some contribution from the local government, enlightening the street, bettering the conditions, doing some acupunctura, urban acupuncture, yeah? To better up the condition of the territorial condition. You know? We also built an observatory on violence, cities, and gender. An observatory that we work together with ECLAC to make it, very methodologically sustainable and serious. And But of course, these are all ups and downs, because we are on work. We are building, continuously building these relationships. And in Latin America, it will depend on the political shape of the ones that are taking the power. In the same moment you change the management of the local authorities or the national authorities, you have to restart again all the negotiation. At this very moment, in Cordoba, the province where I live in Argentina, where we have more than 200 municipalities, small, medium, large, we are trying to build, together with the Women Ministry of the province, a network of municipalities against violence against women, and giving tools to them, training, doing the maps of those cities, trying to make evidence, working with the media. It's so important to work with the media. Yeah? And also working with transport, as you said, Kalpana. The private sector of the transport in our cities was central in all Latin America to make campaigns. We did very good campaigns in the public transport, because there are millions of people moving. And also arise some particular programs like safe transport in the city, in Mexico and in Quito. And we have a lot of experiences, proved, evaluated, good experiences that we would love to share, but it needs more time, because those are experiences that we need to look in detail, in deep, and to see the darks and lights of them, and how to make them better, and how to transfer to other places, and to, of course, accommodate to the context and the conditions, So the training, the safety, the women's safety councils in the cities. You talk about the women's safety committees. We develop within our program in Latin America the Safe Council, women councils in the city, working together with the local authorities to make sure to advise on the violence and women, So, and strengthening the network, strengthening the communities groups, the feminist groups, the networks. This is central, because there is no program that will continue or will subsist or will have a life if there are not the committed feminists and the committed women that have the complete demands from the territories, from the grassroots and from the communities saying, be careful, and working together with the budgets. We did experiences, because in the cities where we started our program, there was also the gender participatory budget. And in some cases, we succeeded in having allocation of budget, not the one we wanted, but we succeeded in the method, in the process, in the allocation of the budget, which was recognizing the issue and recognizing the priority of working these issues on the territories. So all these experiences, and probably I'm forgetting of some, make what you said, and I think this is very important, that is not only safety. Safety is central, but is not only safety, is democratization of cities, is the right of women to the cities. And we are working that in the global platform for the right to the city. In the working group.
I just want to jump in, because I know we're running out of time, and I was a little bit inspired by something that Ellen Woodsworth, who is another one of the moms who were helped birth the movement. At the moment in Canada, we are working on a statement on housing that includes a gender and intersectional approach to be released next week, because I think that it's really important to take advantage of this opportunity. And I want to suggest that it might be useful to have a statement on, for instance, safe public spaces or on global priorities in the rebuilding that's going to need, the economic and social rebuilding that's going to need to happen after the pandemic. Specifically for the Canadians who are on board, Penny Gerstein at the University of British Columbia is involved in that, as am I, and I can provide a link, but that's specifically about redressing housing inequalities, certainly from a feminist perspective. I think that it would be great to see some sort of global effort about what are the issues that are coming up, for instance, in the global pandemic of violence against women that is paralleling the COVID pandemic, and what do we need to do afterwards in order to get positive change out of this terrible global threat, which is only the start of global threats coming out of climate change. Anyhow, I'll just leave it there.
Yeah. I agree, Carolyn. Great, and you should be in this working group of the Right to the Cities of Women, contributing with this. We did a manifesto, and it's published in different languages, so everybody can have access to that. But we need to work each one of the 10 points of the manifesto in this type of statement you are saying, yeah? Because the pandemic will be worse for women. Women are in the informal market. Women are the poorest of the poor. Women will be the most damaged by this pandemic. So we need to be alert. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you.
And I think I'd like to say that, you know, this clearly shows us that the next webinar should focus on this to a great extent. And I think we will work towards that and get a larger number of speakers around that. There have been some fascinating discussions, and I think Kathryn unfortunately keeps coming and going. Her internet seems to be problematic. You never know where it's going to happen, the internet problem. I think one of the questions that's come is really, which I'd like to quickly answer. We have only about 6-7 minutes before I give a last word to each one of us, is that how do we share our positive experiences? How do we create a kind of a knowledge sharing network, you know? And I think this is an important one. I think the amount of interest that we got in this seminar, this webinar, shows me that there are a lot of people working on these issues. There are many new players, many young groups which have started addressing these, a lot of them using social media. And I think we are, seeing a kind of, this time Antonio Guterres has talked about violence during the pandemic, you know, so the Secretary General of the UN talks about it. So clearly we have put it on the agenda. I think it's there. I think there's a lot of material. People have been asking about material. There is the Women in Cities website. There is the Women in Habitat Network website. There is the Jagori website. All these 3 websites have a lot of the documents that we've been talking about in this past 1.5 hours. So I do, and all of you can put it out. We are going to put together all of this material and circulate it. We're going to try and do something to make this. I'm really sorry, it's not possible to answer every question, but I would request my panelists, if they can hang on after this gets over, to answer some of the questions in the question answer box, even for 5 minutes, so that, because some of them are directed only to Carolyn or to Anna or to me, if we could just answer that. And I think it's been a great thing. I'd like to just give Anna and Carolyn a minute to say a last word on this before I wind up. And if Kathryn comes back, wonderful, we'll give her the last word.
Yeah, I mean, Kathryn has done an amazing job chairing, and it's unfortunate that during the question period she dropped out a bit. Look, the initial drive behind Women in Cities International in 2002, coming out of the first global conference, was to act as a repository of good practice and to do research on good practice. The issue for any global organization, WIRO, groups, etc., as well as Women in Cities, is that there's money for projects, but there's very rarely money for ongoing work. And as Anna said, you know, these are movements that have had decades of activism sometimes by the same people and sometimes by different people, and there needs to be the ability to have a clearinghouse of that information. So I know that's sort of, that's one of the priorities, is getting some core funding for that clearinghouse. I just want to, my last word is to say that it's really important to keep in mind that there are inequalities within cities. And Kalpana has talked about how important it was to start with lower income women in their settlements. The work of the Safe City Committee focused a lot on the needs of women of color and Indigenous women and new migrant women, women with disabilities. That intersectional lens when we're talking about inequality is so important. And that I'm just so pleased that there's been that kind of continuity in some ways over 30 years of activism. It's a wonderful thing to see. So I'll end it there.
Anna?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you, Kalpana, for this initiative. And I want to say that from the Women and Habitat Network in Latin America, we learn about some concept, let's say, the recognition among us, the importance of the recognition, because there is a colonialism also in the way of acting, and we need all of us to recognize all of us, yeah? And also we need to respect the autonomy, and this is very important, because building networks in each region is a strong, enormous effort, and as Caroline said, we need support and we need finance, and most of the time we don't have it. It's only our commitment that is keeping on going the wheel. And the third thing we learn is partnership. If we don't work in partnership, and partnership not only among us, with different stakeholders, we need to learn, and we learned the feminists to negotiate. We are real champions in installing new issues in the democratization of the human rights agenda, and we learn that. We learn that in this decades of struggling and trying to be recognized. And also, I want to say that violence is not an individual problem. It's a social problem, and one that is located in bodies and in territories. And we have to make that clear. The problem of the violence is a social violence, is a patriarchal violence, is a colonialist violence that is on the bodies and on the territories. On the territories, even in the extractivism of all the worlds that is taking but few over the needs of the big majorities. So that is creating environments of fear and environments of empty spaces, an environment that create a vicious circle that we need to cut. And fear is the greatest limitation to our rights. And fear for women is the enormous limitation of citizenship. But at the same time, I want to strengthen the concept that we women do not stop doing things because of fear. We transgress and we move even over fear, building our citizenships. And I think we need to put these two things always in balance, because these forces, the forces of the women, the organized women, the feminists, that are really producing all these tools, knowledge, and proposal to overcome these situations we are living in our territories. And in Latin America, that is urban, where more than 82% of people live in cities, in unequal cities, in territories of complex territories. This is a priority for women's life. And thank you very much. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. And now that Kathryn is back, we'll give it over to her for the last words.
I'm so sorry. I don't know what's happening, but tech challenges is something we all face, I suppose. I guess I want to say thank you so much to Safetipin for convening this space, and to all of you, not just for being here for today, but for all of the work that you've done in the past, for all of the space that you created that we continue to benefit from, and for your continued engagement also, which keeps us all collectively moving forward. I think from what we heard today, I mean, some key takeaways from my perspective is one, the importance of that connection. So of that connection amongst each other. So we already hit on those notions of peer learning, of exchange, both within regions and across regions, so that we can keep moving together, right? We talked also about the need for connection across different sectors. And at different levels, right? And so making sure that transportation, urbanists, architects, women's groups, politicians, bus drivers, everyone is kind of working together to make that collective change that we need to see, because it is a bit of a revolution what we're trying to see. We're trying to have a transformative impact at the end of the day, and that means fundamentally changing some of those structures and systems and spaces, right? We talked about the misogyny that is built into the very fabric of our cities, you know, that has to be kind of unbuilt and rethought and reshaped. There's a lot of unlearning to do. I saw a lot of the questions in the Q&A were about culture and about a normalization of disempowerment, and how can we change that, right? And so I think that we have to be bold in our visions. I think that we have to keep moving forward. We have to keep building on the work that's happened instead of just reinventing the wheel. We have to make use of all of that knowledge and think of new and innovative ways of presenting it and of connecting people to issues, so that it doesn't feel like it's something that some people are thinking about, but really something that touches everyone's everyday lives, and something that everyone can feel connected with, can own the data, can own the movement, and can be a part of. And so this, as Kalpana had said at the beginning, is the first of a series of webinars. So this was more on the looking back portion of things. And of course, we're all collectively looking forward together, and we are looking forward to the next webinar as well. So, you know, follow the Safetipin, especially I think at Twitter would be a great place to be able to stay up to date about this. And that hashtag of looking back, looking forward will also stay alive. So I invite all of us also to continue this conversation online. You know, it's a great place where we can connect with people who perhaps are sleeping right now, but who might want to share their thoughts and ideas about some of the conversations that we've been having today. Thank you for bearing with me as I kind of cut in and out as well. Appreciate that, and for continuing to move forward in spite of those challenges.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I think we do need to end. But as Kathryn said, let's continue these conversations on Twitter. All of us are on Twitter. And if there really is a question that we didn't answer, I know we were not able to answer all the questions, but we are happy to continue this conversation. This recording will be available. And do keep a lookout for the next webinar, which is going to be early May, which we are going to be focusing on some of the sort of things that have been happening the past 5-7 years, as well as COVID, and really looking at some of the challenges. And I do think the silent pandemic is, right now it's domestic violence, but the silent pandemic is fueled by patriarchy. And unless we challenge patriarchy, we are not going to look. And I think transformational change is what we want. So thank you everyone for being part of this. We were so thrilled to have nearly 400 registrations, and more than 200 people actually came on and have stayed almost till the end. So thank you again. Good night from my side, but good day to many of you in different parts of the world. And I love this sort of global communion and citizenship that we're able to do this time. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for tuning in, and thank you, Kathryn, for great convening.
Great opportunity.
Thank you, Kathryn.
Great to see you.
Thank you, Carolyn and Anna.
Talk with you, Caroline, Kalpana.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
See you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
So are we over now? Good.